The autumn sun hung low over the dusty fairgrounds of Copper Ridge, Montana, casting long shadows across the livestock pens, where tomorrow's auction would determine the fate of over 40 horses. Among them stood a creature that had become legend. In the surrounding counties, a wild Mustang stallion, so fierce that 3 professional trainers had already refused to work with him. Jake Morrison had been running livestock auctions for 32 years, and he'd never seen an animal quite like this one. The stallion stood 16 hands high, his coat the color of storm clouds, with eyes that held something between fury and heartbreak. Scars marked his shoulders and flanks, testament to years running free across Montana's high plains before the Bureau of Land Management's roundup had brought him here. "That horse is going to kill someone," muttered Frank Peters, Morrison's assistant, auctioneer, watching the Mustang pace, the reinforced steel pen they'd built specifically for him. The animal moved with predatory grace, muscles rippling beneath his scarred hide, nostrils flaring at every sound and movement around him. Morrison wiped sweat from his weathered face, despite the cool evening air. "Bureau says if we can't find him a home tomorrow, he goes to slaughter. They can't keep spending resources on animals that won't adapt to captivity." The words hung heavy between them. Both men had spent their lives around horses, and neither relished the thought of this magnificent creature meeting such an end. But reality was reality. Wild horses that couldn't be controlled represented liability and expense that government agencies couldn't justify indefinitely. "What are you going to start the bidding at?" Frank asked. $500, Morrison replied, "and I'll personally give a $1,000 bonus to anyone who can ride him within 30 days. That ought to attract some attention from the cowboy crowd who think they're invincible." The challenge was posted on social media that evening. By sunrise the next morning, the fairgrounds parking lot overflowed with trucks and horse trailers from 3 states. Word had spread through ranching communities about Morrison's betrayed the untamable Mustang within a month, and collect $1,000 plus the glory of accomplishing what professionals COULDN, single quotes T. by 10 o'clock. The auction barn was packed with over 300 people. Ranchers in weathered Stetsons sat beside weekend cowboys in brand new boots. Horse traders evaluated prospects with calculating eyes, while families with children pointed excitedly at the various animals scheduled for sale. Morrison took his position at the auctioneer's podium, adjusting his microphone and surveying the crowd with the practiced eye of someone who'd conducted thousands of these events. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Copper Ridge Fall Livestock Auction. We've got some fine animals for you today, but I know what you're really here to see." A murmur of anticipation rippled through the crowd. "Before we begin regular proceedings, I want to address the elephant in the room, more should I say, the Mustang in the pen." Morrison's voice carried the rhythmic cadence that made auctioneers famous. "That stallion you've all heard about is real. He's here, and he's every bit as wild as the rumors suggest. I'm offering a personal $1,000 bonus to whoever buys him and can ride him within 30 days. But I'm warning you right now, this is not a horse for amateurs." The crowd erupted in excited chatter. Several burly cowboys in the front rows exchanged confident glances and elbow nudges. This was exactly the kind of challenge that appealed. 2 men who measured their worth by their ability to dominate animals that others feared. "Now, before we get to our special attraction, we've got regular stock to move," Morrison continued, launching into the rapid-fire auction patter that would guide the morning's business. For 2 hours, horses of various breeds and temperaments passed through the auction ring. Quarter horses went to working ranches. Ponies found homes with families seeking gentle mounts for their children. A pair of Belgian draft horses commanded premium prices from an Amish farmer who needed them for fieldwork. But the energy in the barn remained focused on what everyone knew was coming: the moment when the wild Mustang would enter the ring and Morrison would test whether any of these confident cowboys could back up their bravado with cash. Sarah Chen sat in the upper bleachers with her father, Tame, a veterinarian who'd brought his 9-year-old daughter to the auction as an educational experience. The girl had been around horses her entire life, often accompanying her father on ranch calls where she'd learned to read equine body language with uncanny accuracy. "Daddy, why is everyone so excited about that wild horse?" Sarah asked, her dark eyes reflecting curiosity rather than the bloodlust that seemed to grip many of the adults around her. Tom Chen sighed, uncomfortable with the spectacle but understanding the economic realities that governed livestock management. "Some people see a challenge, honey. They want to prove they're tough enough to break an animal that others couldn't handle." "Break?" Sarah's voice carried a note of concern. "Like breaking a toy? It's just an expression," Tom explained gently. "It means training a horse to accept a rider. Though I'll admit, some people take the term too literally and use methods that are harder than they need to be." Sarah fell silent, but her father recognized the thoughtful expression that meant his daughter was processing information in ways that often surprised him with their depth. The regular auction concluded at noon, and Morrison called for a 30-minute lunch break before the main event. The crowd dispersed to food trucks and vendors. their conversation dominated by speculation about the Mustang and predictions about which of the local cowboys would be brave or foolish enough to make a serious bid. When everyone reconvened, the energy in the barn had intensified to almost electric levels. Morrison returned to his podium, flanked by Frank Peters and two ranch hands whose job would be to manage the Mustang's entrance into the auction ring. "Ladies and gentlemen, the moment you've been waiting for," Morrison announced, his voice booming through the sound system. "This BLM Mustang stallion is approximately 8 years old, 16 hands, and as wild as they come. He's never been ridden, never been handled beyond what was necessary to get him here, and he's already sent 2 veterinarians running for cover during his health inspection." Nervous laughter rippled through the crowd. "Before we bring him out, I want to make the terms of my challenge absolutely clear," Morrison continued. "Whoever buys this horse has 30 days to ride him, and by ride, I mean stay mounted for at least 60 seconds without getting bucked off. If you accomplish this, I'll personally hand you $1,000 in addition to whatever bragging rights you earn. But if you fail, that's on you. No refunds, no complaints, no lawsuits because you bit off more than you could chew." Several cowboys in the front rows nodded their acceptance of these terms, already calculating the glory that would come from succeeding where professionals had failed. "All right then, let's bring him out." The barn fell silent as the side gate opened and the ranch hands attempted to guide the Mustang into the auction ring. The stallion exploded through the opening like a force of nature, immediately rearing and striking at the air with hooves that could cave in a man's skull. His eyes rolled white with fear and rage as he took in the crowd. The lights, the unfamiliar environment that represented everything his wild spirit rejected. The audience gasped collectively, many people instinctively leaning back, even though steel fencing separated them from the animal. This was no ordinary difficult horse. This was raw, untamed power that seemed barely contained even by the reinforced barriers Morrison had erected. "As you can see, this is not a beginner's project," Morrison said, his auctioneer's instinct keeping his voice steady despite the drama unfolding before him. "This stallion needs an experienced horseman, someone with the patience and skill to work with an animal that spent his life running free. We're going to start the bidding at $500. Do I hear 500? Silence greeted his opening bid. The Mustang continued his furious pacing, occasionally charging the fence with enough force to rattle the steel posts anchored in concrete. His nostrils flared with each breath, and his ears lay flat against his skull in universal equine expression of aggression and fear. "Come on now, folks," Morrison cajoled, falling into the rhythmic patter that could usually coax bids from reluctant buyers. $500 for a magnificent animal like this. He's got bloodlines that go back to the Spanish conquistadors. The kind of genetics you can't buy at any training stable. Someone give me 500 to get us started." Still silence. Even the cockiest cowboys in the front rows seemed to be reconsidering their earlier confidence now that they could see the reality of what they'd be taking on. The Mustang's fury was palpable, filling the barn with tension that made people shift uncomfortably in their seats. Morrison dropped his opening bid. "All right, 400. Surely someone sees the potential in this animal. $400, that's less than you'd pay for a Greenbroke trail horse. And this stallion has 10 times the spirit." A hand rose hesitantly from the middle section. 400, called a rancher Morrison recognized as someone who'd successfully worked with difficult horses before. "There we go. I've got 400. Do I hear 4? Another hand, this time from a cowboy whose reputation for rough breaking had earned him both respect and criticism in equal measure. 450, 450. Do I hear 5? The bidding crept upward in small increments, reaching $700 before stalling completely. The final bidder was Clint Dawson, a rodeo contractor known for supplying bucking stock to events across the region, a man whose interest in the Mustang clearly ran toward exploitation rather than partnership. 700 once, 700 twice, $1,000. The voice was small, clear, and completely unexpected. Every head in the barn turned toward the upper bleachers where Sarah Chen stood with her hand raised high, her father's eyes wide with shock beside her. "Sarah, what are you doing?" Tom Chen whispered urgently, reaching to pull his daughter's hand down, but Morrison had already recognized the bid, his auctioneer's instinct overriding any judgment about who should or shouldn't be bidding on a dangerous animal. "I've got 1,000 from the young lady in Section C. Do I hear 1,100? Clint Dawson turned in his seat, his weathered face twisting with amusement and contempt. "You've got to be kidding me, Morrison. That's a child with a valid bid," Morrison replied, suddenly finding himself in unexpected ethical territory. He looked up at Tom Chen, whose expression suggested he was equally shocked by his daughter's action. "Sir, is this bid legitimate? Does your daughter have access to funds?" Tom Chen's mind raced. Sarah had a savings account containing money from birthdays, holidays, and small jobs helping at his veterinary clinic. Last he'd checked, it contained approximately $1,200, a fortune for a 9-year-old, and apparently enough to make her believe she could purchase a wild Mustang. "I think she does have savings," Tom admitted, still processing what was happening. "But Sarah, honey, we can't take care of a wild horse. Where would we even keep him?" At the clinic, Sarah said with the simple confidence that children bring to complex problems, "You've got those empty paddocks behind the barn. And I'm not going to try to break him, Daddy. I'm going to help him trust people again." Her words carried through the microphone system, and something in their sincerity created a ripple of emotional response through the crowd. Here was a child offering not dominance but partnership, not breaking but healing. Morrison found himself in an unprecedented situation. Every instinct told him to reject the bid, to protect this child from an animal that could kill her with a single kick. But auction rules were auction rules, and technically, nothing prevented a minor from bidding if they had access to legitimate funds and a guardian present. Mr. Chen, Morrison said carefully, "I need to know if you're willing to take responsibility for this purchase should your daughter's bid stand." Tom looked down at Sarah, seeing something in her eyes that he'd witnessed before, an absolute conviction that defied logic but had somehow never led her wrong when it came to animals. In 9 years, he'd watched his daughter connect with creatures that others had given up on. An injured coyote that the wildlife services had deemed beyond rehabilitation. A starving dog so traumatized it wouldn't let anyone near until Sarah sat patiently beside it for 6 hours. A barn cat that had gone feral after years of abuse. Against every particle of common sense he possessed, Tom Chen heard himself say, "Yes, I'll take responsibility." The barn erupted in chaos. Half the crowd shouted objections, arguing that it was irresponsible and dangerous to let a child purchase such a volatile animal. The other half seemed caught between amusement and curiosity, wondering if they were about to witness either spectacular failure or something unexpectedly remarkable. Clint Dawson stood up, his voice cutting through the noise. "I'll bid 1,100. Let's stop this nonsense right now." Sarah called immediately, her voice unwavering. 1,200, Dawson countered, his tone making clear he viewed this as a personal challenge now. 1,300, Sarah responded, exceeding her available funds but speaking with confidence that made her father's heart sink. "Sarah, you don't have," Tom began, but his daughter cut him off. "You can loan me the rest. Daddy, I'll pay you back from helping at the clinic." Morrison struggled to maintain control of the auction. "We've got 1,300 from the young lady. Mr. Dawson, do I hear 1,400? Dawson crossed his arms, his expression sour. "This is ridiculous." "Fine, let the kid learn a hard lesson about reality. I'm out. 1,300 once, 1,300 twice." Morrison paused, giving anyone else a chance to intervene. When no additional bids came, he brought his gavel down with a crack that echoed through the barn. "Sold. To the young lady in Section C for $1,300? The crowd exploded with reactions ranging from applause to shouted warnings about liability and common sense. But Sarah Chen simply smiled, her eyes fixed on the Mustang that was still pacing his pen with barely contained fury, completely unaware that his fate had just shifted in ways no one could have predicted. As Tom Chen processed the financial and logistical nightmare his daughter had just created, Morrison's voice came over the speaker system one final time. "Ladies and gentlemen, I stand by my original offer. If this young lady or anyone working with her can ride that stallion within 30 days, the $1,000 bonus stands. But I'm also adding a new condition, Mr. Chen. As a veterinarian, I'm holding you personally responsible for ensuring your daughter's safety around this animal. The first sign of danger, this deal is off and the horse goes back to the BLM, understood?" Tom nodded grimly, already planning the safety protocols he'd need to implement, and wondering if his daughter had just bought a magnificent animal or an expensive catastrophe. The next morning, as sunrise painted the Montana sky in shades of amber and rose, Tom Chen stood in his veterinary clinic's largest paddock, watching 2 ranch hands carefully unload the wild Mustang into a reinforced enclosure he'd spent the previous evening constructing. The stallion exploded from the trailer, immediately testing every section of fencing with charges that rattled the posts and sent dirt flying from his hooves. His fury hadn't diminished overnight, if anything. The trailer, ride, and new environment had amplified his distrust of humans and everything they represented. Sarah stood beside her father, wearing jeans and boots but no expression of fear. She watched the Mustang with the same focused intensity she brought to studying injured animals. Reading his body language as he moved, "He's scared," she said quietly. "He's dangerous," Tom corrected. "Sarah, I need you to promise me you won't go near that fence unless I'm present. This isn't like the injured animals we've worked with before. This horse could kill you without even meaning to." "I know, Daddy, but look at how he keeps checking the fence line. He's not trying to hurt anyone, he's trying to find a way home." Tom had to admit his daughter was right. The Mustang's behavior, while aggressive, was fundamentally defensive rather than predatory. The animal was terrified, displaced from everything familiar, surrounded by threats he couldn't escape. For 3 days, Sarah did nothing but sit outside the paddock. She brought her homework, her books, even her meals, establishing a presence without demanding interaction. The Mustang ignored her initially, too focused on pacing his boundaries and testing his confinement to acknowledge the small human who seemed content simply to exist in his space. On the 4th day, something shifted. The stallion stopped pacing long enough to study Sarah with more than passing attention. His ears, which had remained flat against his skull since arriving, pricked forward slightly, a subtle sign of curiosity breaking through defensive aggression. Sarah began talking to him, not commands or training words, but simple narration of her daily activities. She described her schoolwork, told stories about her friends, explained the plot of books she was reading. Her voice was calm, rhythmic, devoid of demands or expectations. Tom watched this strange ritual with growing fascination and persistent worry. Professionally, he knew that horse training required eventual ascension, haltering, establishing physical contact that built toward riding, but his daughter seemed content with mere proximity, as if she understood something about this animal that traditional training wisdom missed. By the end of the first week, the Mustang had stopped charging the fence when Sarah approached. His aggressive displays had diminished to wary surveillance, his body language shifting from attack posture to guarded observation. When Sarah spoke, his ears swiveled to track her voice, though he maintained careful distance. Word of the unusual training approach had spread through Copper Ridge, and by the second week, a steady stream of locals found reasons to stop by Tom Chen's clinic to observe the daily ritual of a small girl sitting peacefully while a wild horse gradually learned to accept her presence. Jake Morrison appeared on day 10, his auctioneer's skepticism warring with genuine curiosity about what he was witnessing. "I've got to admit, I didn't think she'd last 3 days before reality set in, but that horse looks different than he did at auction." Tom nodded, watching Sarah read aloud from a book while the Mustang grazed within 20 feet of her, closer than he'd allowed any human since his capture. "She's not trying to dominate him. She's just showing him that not all humans are threats." "You think she can actually ride him in 30 days? Morrison asked. "Honestly, I have no idea, but I'm beginning to think my daughter understands something about horses that most trainers miss entirely." On day 15, Sarah began leaving small piles of grain near the fence line, always placing them during her regular sitting sessions without attempting to force interaction. The Mustang watched these offerings with suspicion initially, but eventually hunger and curiosity overcame wariness. He approached cautiously, nostrils flaring to test for danger, before quickly snatching mouthfuls of grain and retreating to safe distance. Each day, Sarah placed the grain slightly closer to where she sat. The process was glacially slow, requiring patience that would have defeated most adults. But the 9-year-old seemed content to operate on the Mustang's timeline rather than human expectations. By day 20, the stallion was eating grain from a bucket that Sarah held while sitting perfectly still, her small hand nowhere near his head, but close enough that his warm breath occasionally stirred her hair. Tom captured video of these moments, documenting a training approach that defied conventional wisdom, but seemed to be achieving results that force and dominance had failed to produce. 3 days left. Frank Peters commented on day 20, joining the growing crowd of observers who'd become regular fixtures at the Chen clinic. Morrison's starting to think he might actually have to pay out that bonus. The real test came on day 20. Sarah entered the paddock for the first time not to ride, but simply to exist in the Mustang space without barriers between them. Tom's heart hammered with fear as he watched his daughter walk slowly toward the center of the enclosure. Moving with deliberate calm that somehow communicated non-threatening intention, the stallion snorted and trotted to the far fence, his body language shifting back toward defensive wariness. But he didn't charge, didn't attack, simply watched as Sarah sat in the dirt and resumed her usual routine of talking quietly while offering no demands. 45 minutes later, the Mustang approached her. His steps were tentative, each movement accompanied by pauses to assess danger. But he came closer than he'd ever been without a fence between them. When he stood just feet away, Sarah slowly extended her hand not to touch, but to offer her scent for investigation. The Mustang lowered his head, nostrils fluttering as he processed information about this small human, who'd spent a month simply existing peacefully in his world. His whiskers brushed her palm, and Sarah remained perfectly still, letting the animal make all decisions about the pace of interaction. On day 30, the entire town seemed to converge on Tom Chen's clinic. Jake Morrison had promoted the event through social media, and over 200 people gathered around the paddock to witness whether Sarah Chen could accomplish what she'd set out to ride, a wild Mustang that had defeated professional trainers. But Sarah had different plans. When Morrison asked if she was ready to attempt riding the stallion, the girl shook her head. "I'm not going to ride him today." The crowd erupted in confused protests. Morrison's face reflected disappointment, mixed with relief. He'd secretly been dreading the moment when this child risked her life, trying to mount an animal that could still kill her with a single kick. "Sarah, the bet was to ride him in 30 days. Morrison said gently. "If you don't at least try, you forfeit the challenge." "I'm not forfeiting," Sarah replied calmly. "I'm just not ready to ride him yet. He's not ready either. We need more time." Tom Chen felt torn between pride in his daughter's wisdom and frustration at the financial loss this decision represented. $1,300 was not insignificant money for a veterinarian supporting a family in rural Montana, and the $1,000 bonus would have helped considerably. But then Sarah did something that made the entire crowd fall silent. She walked into the paddock carrying nothing but a simple rope halter, no bridle, no saddle, no equipment designed to force compliance. The Mustang watched her approach, his posture alert but not aggressive. When she reached him, Sarah simply stood beside the stallion's shoulder and began running her hands along his neck with gentle, rhythmic strokes. The wild horse that had terrorized auction barn workers, sent veterinarians running, and defeated professional trainers stood perfectly still, accepting touch from a 9-year-old girl who'd never tried to dominate or break his spirit. After several minutes of this quiet interaction, Sarah slipped the rope halter over the Mustang's head. He tossed his mane once, testing the unfamiliar sensation, but didn't fight or flee. Then, moving with deliberate slowness, Sarah led the stallion in a complete circle around the paddock. The sight of that wild Mustang following a small girl with no resistance, no force, nothing but earned trust, struck the assembled crowd with emotional impact that transcended any rodeo trick or training demonstration. This wasn't dominance. It was partnership. Ladies and gentlemen, Jake Morrison's voice cracked slightly as he spoke into a portable microphone. I believe we've just witnessed something more significant than any riding demonstration could have shown us. This young lady didn't break a wild horse, she earned his trust. And that, in my 32 years in this business, is something I've rarely seen accomplished. He descended from the viewing platform and approached the paddock fence, pulling out his checkbook. Sarah Chen, you didn't meet the technical terms of my challenge, but you've accomplished something far more valuable. You've shown all of us that patience and respect can achieve what force and dominance cannot. Morrison wrote out a check and handed it through the fence. $1,000, paid not for riding, but for teaching an old auctioneer that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust instead of dominate. The crowd erupted in applause, but Sarah barely seemed to notice. She was focused on the Mustang, reading his body language, ensuring that the unusual situation didn't overwhelm the fragile trust they'd built over 30 careful days. As the crowd dispersed and Tame Chen processed the surreal experience of watching his 9-year-old daughter accomplish something that had defeated trained professionals, Sarah led the Mustang to his water trough and removed the halter. When will you ride him? Tom asked quietly. Sarah smiled, running her hand along the stallion's shoulder one final time before leaving the paddock. When he invites me to, Daddy, not before. It took another 6 weeks before that invitation came. 6 weeks of continued daily interaction, of Sarah introducing saddle pads and gradually increasing weight on the Mustang's back, of teaching him that cooperation brought rewards rather than punishment. When she finally mounted him for the first time, it happened without ceremony or audience. Tom looked out his clinic window one morning to see his daughter sitting astride the stallion, no longer wild but not broken either, transformed into something that both training philosophies missed entirely, a partner. The story of the little girl and the untamable Mustang spread far beyond Copper Ridge. Videos of Sarah working with the stallion went viral, generating millions of views from people hungry for narratives that valued patience over force, partnership over dominance. Horse trainers from across the country contacted Tame Chen, asking about his daughter's methods. What they discovered was that Sarah didn't have a method. She had empathy, patience, and the willingness to operate on the animal's timeline rather than human convenience. Jake Morrison's auction business transformed as well. He began requiring potential buyers of difficult horses to demonstrate patience-based handling skills, refusing to sell animals to anyone whose primary training philosophy involved breaking spirit rather than building trust. But the real transformation happened in the broader community. Children who'd witnessed Sarah's success began asking for opportunities to work with difficult animals. Adults who'd spent lives trying to dominate nature through force started reconsidering approaches that valued partnership over dominance. 3 years later, Sarah Chen stood in that same paddock, now 12 years old and training her third rescue Mustang, using methods that had revolutionized how her community understood the relationship between humans and horses. The stallion from Morrison's auction, now named Freedom, grazed peacefully nearby, occasionally wandering over to nuzzle the girl who'd proven that the wildest spirits don't need breaking, they need understanding. And somewhere in Montana, 1,000 little girls looked at Sarah's story and learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is trust instead of dominate, listen instead of command, and believe that patience can accomplish what force never could.